This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
That's right, you have to render them inert. Oh, God. That's your right, a USB and water bottle museum. It's always better on two screens, isn't it? Oh, this one flashes, so even better. Okay. So, I'm going to talk to you for the next 40 minutes or so about new urbanism. Then we're going to have a little break, and then James is going to take over and talk about heritage issues. These things there'll be a nice kind of, what do you call it, a revisit from a different angle next week when, because I'm going to talk again about some of the backlash things that Lauren alluded to last week, and this will all tie together seamlessly. We'll tie together seamlessly. Speaking of which, Catherine wanted me to remind you that there have been changes to the lecture schedule, largely because we have a very important guest lecturer coming at the end of the month who couldn't fit in with the allotted time, so we had to shift some other things around in between, and we're very lucky to have this person, so because she's brilliant, and you'll really enjoy that lecture, so I'm not going to, that these things just happen. Do you have a question, or you just, no? Oh, sorry. You look so inquisitive. Okay, I know what that looks like. I don't see it often, but I could recognise it when I see it. Okay, so I want to talk about new urbanism today, and I want to acknowledge, over time, I don't want to refer to them as baggage. Over time, when I've been teaching this course for 10 years now, and people pass through and they make very valuable contributions. And I've named two people there. I think it's always good to acknowledge people who have assisted, who've given to the cause along the way. Okay, so I keep saying I'm going to talk about new urbanism, but before I do absolutely get into that, I just want to talk about this. I mentioned this on LMS, and it was kind of possibly a surprise to some of you a few days ago, and then as soon as I dangled it in front of your face, I whisked it away because you might have noticed 11 o'clock last Saturday, we had a torrential downpour. And we kind of knew that was coming, but we weren't sure because there were different weather forecasts throughout the week, and it was like, by Friday it was like, well, at the beginning of the week they said there was 30% chance of rain. By Friday they were saying 90%. I woke up on Saturday morning, they said 100% chance of rain. So I figured that this would not happen. Now this, however, it's a field trip that we have in the past in my undergraduate course, which I run kind of two undergraduate courses at the moment, one in the old degree, one in the new degree, with my colleague Victoria Kalankovic. And what we tend to do is we try to have three a semester in the undergraduate course, but the weather it's been really against us. There's been all kinds of warnings from the heavens about these field trips must not happen. So in any case, we're pretty certain it's going to happen this coming Saturday. A 2-hour field trip to Footscray in the morning, starting at 11, meeting at Footscray Station. Now, you're not even enrolled in this course, so obviously it's not compulsory for these students, and it's not compulsory for you, obviously. But particularly, I think these field trips are amazingly good for people who are new to Melbourne, who don't have reasons to go out and about in Melbourne much. I always think of my own experience. I lived in Sydney for 13 years, and I never had any strong, compelling reasons to go to various parts of Sydney, apart from where I, lived and worked and socialised, which was actually a very small area. So it can be really eye-opening and mind-broadening to go on these trips if you possibly can, whenever they're offered. And also, it's extremely interesting stuff in itself, and totally pertinent to the kinds of things that we're looking at in this course. So I don't know if I think I've explained all that. It is for another course. It's a course that I run, so I'll be there. James, will you? I'll be there. James, if you know James, he'll be there. Well, whether you know him or not, he'll be there. And it will be, probably not a huge group. There's a lot of students enrolled in that course, but for various reasons, it's really it's the greatest and most engaged students who come along. So it won't be like 200 people shuffling down the pathway. It might be 30 or 40 at the most. So please feel free to come along. There'll be details on LMS. Now I think my 40 minutes is up. No, I've got just enough time to tell you one more thing. And this actually pertains more to next week's lecture and discussions when we talk about things like democracy and so on. But I couldn't help but be, I don't know if any of you guys saw this in today's paper. This is fascinating stuff. Partly, I guess my initial impulse is probably like many of the commenters on this article. So this is a new railway station that's being opened. There are certain protocols about what you can name railway stations after. You can't name them after local schools. So this was going to be this new railway station, which is actually, do not apologise for being a historian, which is actually along the route of an old railway line that was closed, I think, in the 50s. This new railway station was going to be named after a local school. Then somebody noticed that you can't name stations after schools, so they came up with this name, Middle Gorge, which has the locals up in arms somewhat. Has upset quite a lot of people, including one of our colleagues in our faculty, Crystal Legacy, who is mentioned in the article as well, although I don't think quoted. I find this so interesting in so many ways, but of course one of the things that's really, really interesting, I don't know if James is going to bring this up, he has had quite a bit of involvement in the protests against the Apple Store. Sorry, James, have I blown your cover here? I don't know. Do you do that under a pseudonym? I'm not sure. I know, in disguise. And some of these questions about community consultation. Now, to my mind, this is so minor that it's ridiculous, and I don't know if you saw the competition that went on about what were we going to name the new stations on the new City Loop. A lot of people had very humorous, not at all funny, but humorous suggestions, and there was also really intriguingly a little bit of a, this much of a kerfuffle when someone suggested an Aboriginal name, and other people said, well, we don't want a name that we can't understand and don't know how to pronounce, which of course is nonsense, because like Middle Gorge, I think, personally, I feel that, almost anything, you get used to almost anything very quickly, and, it's more like the shock of seeing something new than it is anything else. Nevertheless, community consultation was one of the key objections here. And I guess that question about what kind of process people expect to be invited into, the idea of having that put before you as a possibility that you can have some kind of input into what a local place will be named. One of the other objections to the Middle Gorge name was, apparently, I don't know that area that well, I've been there a few times, but it commemorates or it acknowledges a local geographical feature which is apparently very difficult to access from the station itself. So there's seen to be a kind of irony in the fact that it's named for something that's in the area but which you'd have a lot of trouble getting to if you were to take the train to this Middle Gorge railway station. Anyway, have a look at this item. It's in today's age, so it's today's news, and think about it in terms of the kind of things that we are putting before you in this course. I think it's it is only a question of nomenclature. It's not a major thing in anybody's language really, but I guess for some people, like these nice people you see here in the bottom of the clipped image, it's a major thing to them, and it's that's one of the things that I think is worth bearing in mind, particularly if we are looking at a future in various areas of engagement with the built environment and places where actual people actually live. So, very briefly and quickly, if I can ever be brief and quick, I want to go through some of the ideas that we've come to in this course and thought a bit about as we went through. Hopefully, those questions. Of course, this is my big bugbear: the historical roots of planning, but that also ties into the justification of planning. The values. I think the values are the real. To me, that's the. I don't like this term, but meat and potatoes of the whole deal. The values of planning. Of course, they're historically based. Of course, they come with, some kind of justification underpinning. But the values are the real issue at stake. And one of the things that I think is important to be aware of when we look at the history, in particular, of planning, we look at modernist planning, which, to simplify it, to boil it down to a very basic idea, modernist planning is essentially saying, there's a recipe, it's a wonderful recipe that we perfected, and, sorry, can't go to a lecture theatre without someone building some freaking skyscraper next door. I'll pick it up again in a second. It's just replaying the tape. So the idea that there's a kind of recipe or a set amount of ideas that you need to understand, and then you can roll this out any way you please. It's exactly the thing that Patrick Geddes was against 100 years ago when he was saying, understand your site, understand your people and the local culture and the local practices and learn from those practices. Don't just accommodate them or say very nice practices you used to have here. Actually accommodate them into what you're doing, so you can insert your planning infrastructure and your and other elements of what you bring into the existing culture and society. So the idea of the values is the idea of values doesn't just mean understanding the values of the people that you're working with / for or on. It also means understanding your own values, and I think that is, in fact, I keep saying everything's more important than everything else, but that is possibly the most important thing. What you come to, your understanding of why you're doing things and who you're doing them for. Because, of course, the planner, let's say in Australia in 2018, has a lot of stakeholders and possibly also a few bosses, and it's sometimes hard to know where one ends and the other begins. And the planner in 2018 has to also, remain ethical and in touch with their own, understanding of why they became a planner in the first place. From what I understand, not easy. So that's one of those questions that I think you should always, when you become a fully qualified planner, assuming some of you probably already are, but when you become a fully qualified planner, when you wake up in the morning, I want you to always say, what are the fundamental aims and objectives of planning? I think that is important. Try and put it into a song or something and sing it to yourself and anyone else who happens to be around. Every year I see that word adaptational, and I know that's not a word. So let's assume that's meant to be adaptational. So the idea of, and once again, I guess I don't want to keep summoning Geddes. One day his ghost will turn up and tell us all what I'm completely wrong about him. This idea of, once again, it was something that, I don't know why Le Corbusier comes to mind, and I'm not accusing him of being some kind of planning fascist exactly, but I think that there are some planners who would, in the past, who would have said, once we get it right, we don't even need to change. We only need to add, probably, add more, but the essential structure, relating as it does to the way that people live, breathe, behave, think, act, should be, good for a few thousand years at least. Yet I think we've realised that it's a constant process of change, and this is also a pretty delightful thing that I think you really need to be always mindful. This is not exactly that, but somebody wise did tell me on the weekend that it was a proven fact that practitioners always benefit from reading outside their discipline, whatever they read. So, and I think that also extends to watching bad sitcoms or binging TV drama or or whatever. But you always learn from outside your actual discipline, and you should look on everything as. I guess it's the approach that's really important. How you approach that stuff and how you understand it as informing your own practice. Some of these notions that relate to modernism are, they're almost like, they're like a bunch of thought bubbles, aren't they? That really, I guess in some ways belong to some of these we haven't encountered yet. That's okay. Consider it a first taste. Ditto of postmodernism and postmodern planning. Something that we'll get to is also worth thinking about it, and also, I mean, in a way, it would not be entirely alien to you to come across a whole lot of stuff about postmodern planning. You go, well, a lot of that is the way that we think and behave now. Similarly, some of the notions, you know, you could kind of stick modernism, postmodernism on top of these kinds of notions as well, these columns, to a certain degree. But what I really want to talk to you about is new urbanism, which is a different kettle of fish in lots of ways, and while it is a kind of practice that is very aware of the modernist past, and even to a certain degree the pre-modern past, I would love to hear, and we'll have to set some kind of tutorial paper or exam question about this. I would love to hear how you understood the value, if any, of new urbanism and this kind of idea. I guess the reason that I focus on new urbanism in this course is because it seems to me to be a very, very obvious example of people looking to the past and saying, wait, we threw the baby out with the bathwater. What a disturbing concept. We threw, you know, we chucked out all these ideas. We embraced something that seemed to be a saviour for the problems of, let's say, the early 20th century, and in doing so, we lost sight of a whole lot of valuable things. There's all kinds of problems with that understanding of new urbanism and old urbanism, for that matter. But it's, I think, it is the way that a lot of people approach the new urbanist idea. To the degree, I mean, in one sense, new urbanism it's a little bit, you know, last year's thing, possibly even in some senses last century's thing. But we've certainly become we've passed through, and some of us are still in that phase of understanding the best way to design particularly suburbs and streets and places. All kinds of interesting issues come up from the way that we see, the way that new urbanists see the world, and the way that the kinds of principles that they evoke, often looking at the past, looking at the relatively distant past. And it's always been my feeling that it's a very basic reading of how things used to be, not a strong understanding of history, and that to me is its downfall in many ways. So here's this little quote is just one example of the kind of issues that we have with, or that I have with new urbanists, and others do as well. New urbanists might well point to this kind of mixture of, I guess, a nominally organic, but with a whole lot of infill grid plan as well. Point to this kind of idea of a natural city, in a manner of speaking. It's grown over a very long period of time, and it's quirky. There is, for various reasons, a lot of open space. It's certainly, even though it's, you know, you can see that there's roads for everybody. It's not car-based in the sense that, you know, it's not about the quickest route from A to B necessarily. In fact, I think it'd probably be massively frustrating to get around. And I don't know if you know about this place, but the notion of an artificial city where, you know, traffic, and I would say, you know, motorcar ownership aspiration was one of the major elements of the design of Milton Keynes, and so much about, you know, well, everyone knows the roundabouts. We had that discussion last week, and those big roads around each of these blocks in this kind of distorted grid in Milton Keynes, which I just want to emphasise. Lauren didn't make me go to Milton Keynes. Okay, Lauren doesn't. I don't do what Lauren tells me to. I just want you to know that. But I was very intrigued. She just started doing her PhD, and I'd sort of semi-known about it, but I didn't really have the background. And the actual place it is really an extraordinary place, and it is an extremely functional place. And it's another one of those places that I would put in the same category as Canberra, where the people that live there love it, and the people that don't live there and see a little bit of it, just have a little mini experience, or they read about it or whatever, they have problems with it, partly out of not necessarily, well, partly not understanding it, possibly also because there's nothing, there's not a lot of stuff there for them. It's actually a residential community that has that kind of community angle. It's possibly in some ways quite insular. It's a place that you have to be there for a while before you understand it. I still go there in my dreams. Okay. It has things like this, which is I find quite fascinating as well. As kind of I can't remember if Lauren talked about this, but the places like this market. I went to a new town in Paris a couple of years ago. It had the same kind of thing. I'm not quite sure who comes up with these ideas in this instance, but clearly it's like an idea that we're going to take out the sterility of the modernist landscape by putting in an old-fashioned marketplace, looking very temporary, looking very ad hoc, and looking like something that local people wanted to do, which it probably isn't. But certainly it's well frequented, and it's popular, and it's an enjoyable place to go to. You might know that we have something very similar right here on a Wednesday. So, not really as exciting, but not really as exciting as Milton Keynes Market or the one I went to in Paris, but a similar kind of idea, I think, in some ways, the farmers market notion installed, bringing some kind of something, that does go back to a 19th century idea of what citizens want, what brings people together, what makes people a community. It's this idea of a very, I don't want to say random, because it's not random, but it has a kind of holistic, down-to-earth, grassroots kind of feel to it. And that area up there is it is a very modernist courtyard space, and it's the same kind of ideas, I think, in that place. So, new urbanism. We have famously a couple of men and one woman who are generally considered to be the founders of new urbanism. Andres Duany, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, whose name I haven't put on that slide for some reason, and Peter Calthorpe are the three main people. And you've got to think about the way that Americans see their past because I guess these people are active largely in America, not exclusively, but they certainly, this is where the idea of new urbanism takes hold. And Americans have such a, that's an incredibly awful, terrible generalisation, isn't it? Many Americans have such a strong sentimental idea about a past that didn't really exist. Talk about things like these Norman Rockwell images. Here's the beautiful thing, the friendly policeman who's found the boy who's running away from home and bought him an ice cream soda. That kind of stuff where, community matters and people in these small town kind of America ideas. There's a lot of great Hollywood movies about this kind of thing, even up to the present day, that evokes this sense of like a place where everybody knows who you are and where you fit in, and will bring you some chicken soup if you're sick, that kind of stuff. When people like Clarence Stein create places like Chatham Village in the 1930s, he's certainly harking back to the notion of what makes a good community, all the components. Stein was a master of this kind of, isolating these perfect components to a good community. Now, of course, it's Chatham Village. It's really just a suburb, so the village thing is aspirational in itself. When we talk about people like Le Corbusier, I think we see someone who is, in one sense, working absolutely in the opposite, going the opposite direction. But at the same time, Le Corbusier also talked about the way that people would ideally operate close together in these kinds of structures. So each one would be a town. Each one of these skyscrapers would be a town. That kind of notion as well. The new urbanists. That said, I mean, this is the bad opposite, I guess, from the new urbanists' point of view. This was the big mistake that happened in the 1920s and 30s. Not that much of Le Corbusier's work in this nature got built. It was nevertheless seen as the awful thing that went wrong, particularly because it went so car-oriented in so many ways. So in some ways transit-oriented from Le Corbusier's point of view, but it was really about travelling from A to B and not enjoying the journey, minimising the journey. The new urbanists looked to places like Coral Gables in Florida, which is 1920s suburban development with, as you can see, open space and transit and so on, and a water feature. But the really important thing that happened was in the 1980s when Douani and Plater Zyberg were asked to design a holiday village in Florida which was to be called Seaside. And in this case, the person that requested this from them did actually bring up some of the things that he'd envisaged from his boyhood, things that he was sentimental about, and he hoped that they might be able to make something special in that regard. And nobody was saying at the time this is going to change the way that people see the world, but in fact, in many ways it has, and like almost anything, with a huge amount of misunderstanding, but nevertheless, Seaside has become a template for thousands of other places around the world. Some of the things that it does, as you can see, it's reasonably dense, it's very walkable. Walkability is one of the major aspects here. It's also, it has to be said, because it's out in the middle of nowhere basically, it's very car-oriented. I don't have any of the pictures that you can find very easily online of Seaside, but a lot of the people who live there have cars as big as their houses. They, and also, I guess the other thing, which is an ongoing issue with new urbanism, is it's an expensive place to live. This is an expensive kind of place to build and create. If I don't get to it now, if I don't get to it, I'll say it now. The Douani says, yes, it's expensive now to make these ideal, high-minded new urbanist places, but the more that we inspire people and the more people build them, the cheaper they get, and it should become common practice. Here's a Calthorpe design for Stapleton, a place that was on the site of the old airport in Denver, Colorado, and quite a remarkable design, once again, to these kinds of new urbanist principles that echoes in many ways the 1920s and 30s American suburb, the pre-automobile suburb. You can see all the tiny little components of open space that are essentially for children to play in, so focusing very much on the very local neighbourhood, small stores. It is, once again, you can't get far in the USA by recommending something that's not going to be automobile based, but the automobiles in this instance are they have access ways to the rear of the houses, so nobody parks in the street. The place is very governed. There's a lot of public behaviours that you're supposed to adhere to, and people appear to do so happily. If you're interested in Stapleton, and why wouldn't you be? Can I recommend there's someone, and God, what an amazing person. I don't know who they are, but someone is creating I think it's a monthly newsletter. It's an online newsletter. It's called the Stapletonian, and it's a satire, but it also gives you a good sense of the values that people have in Stapleton. The Stapletonian is, it is really, really fascinating. Some of it is broader satire about America, and some of it is so local I certainly don't get it. But I absolutely recommend it as a kind of to get a good sense of what it's like to live in a community like this. And obviously, at least some people there like living there and like laughing about it as well. So Calthorpe's ideas and Duane's and Plato Zyberg's as well, carrying far and wide. Now this is not. I think. Let me think. This is not a Calthorpe, but Calthorpe did do. Was a consultant on something even further north in Perth. So he is getting around the world and having a lot of traction. His ideas are having a lot of traction. Gungahlin and the ACT is just one more suburb in a way in Canberra, but it's also to the same kinds of ideas. And you can see, just if if I showed you this as a flashcard and a random 1920s town plan design, you would have a lot of trouble telling the difference. I'm saying the scenic endpoints, the combination of grid and curved roads. All the roads are through roads. There's no cul-de-sacs. One of the things that the new urbanists are very against is the notion of the cul-de-sac, and walkability is a key element. Amesbury, which some of you are probably familiar with, out in the west of Melbourne, highly contentious, possibly doesn't even belong really in this kind of slideshow, but Amesbury is certainly, once again, worth thinking about as a master planned. They call it a town. It's obviously a suburb, but it's a suburb, surrounded entirely by open space. So it's a suburb, I think, because in my mind, because there's only one road in, one road out, and you have to drive it, and you are very likely to be working somewhere in Melbourne itself. So it's in many ways a dormitory suburb to Melbourne. And so on, and so on, and on we go. The endpoint idea is really key, as it was 100 years ago in town planning designs. The kind of architecture that's been put forward is often, I would say pre-modern. It's 19th or even 18th century styles, which is quite jarring in some ways, and also a little bit bizarre. In this instance, the mixture of commercial and retail, and so this is something that's retail and residential is really important, and this kind of idea of mixing it up is very is core to the new urbanist idea. Modernism, I suppose, and modern zoning and so on said absolutely we have to separate. We have to separate industry, where people work, where people live. These places have to be different places, and new urbanists look to some examples from let's say the 19th century, and they say, well, it used to work. Apart from anything else, the journey to work was much shorter if you worked 3 doors away from where you lived, but also it's healthier in a way. It's socially healthier to have this kind of mix. Hiding the cars away within the blocks is one thing that's not that. It's not really core to. It's not unique to new urbanism, but it's something that they like to do. And all these are very. These are often, in many instances, quite luxurious and boutique designs for village-style living. Notoriously celebration, the Disney Corporation's evocation of American village life. Wonderful Dolores Hayden piece about going to Celebration and being unable to get any public transport and so on, which is, in some ways you sort of go, well, you're a funny person for thinking that you could, but in another sense you think it is, of course, it's a place that cherry picks the visuals and some of those components from a traditional lifestyle, and ignores the fact, of course, that the traditional lifestyle never really existed. Let's put that to one side. But also that a lot of it is extremely superficial. Kentlands is very popular and seen as a great example of an area that works, a new urbanist area that works, and some of these places, go in very deep in the sense of trying to make that social mix in particular work as well as possible. This, by the way, is from Dolores Hayden, and it's a, in some ways it's Hayden producing her alternative version of how a suburban area could be redesigned for, particularly to maximise the quality of life for women and children, or mothers of children, I suppose, and the children and families. So you can see from that figure 5B, proposed homes revitalisation and the common space and so on. I mean, these are things that new urbanists often try to build into their designs. I always like to read the scrawled comments in books. So if you're the kind of person who borrows books from the library, first of all, you're pretty unique in this student body. But if you're the kind of person who borrows books from the library and scribbles things in the margins, please keep doing it. It gives us a very valuable understanding of kind of crazy things that people, think, just like that. Instant response. So this person, community, 3 asterisks. Possibly out of a possible 5. I don't know. I like this. People resent living like that, I think, is what that's meant to say. Some people just can't help themselves. And this also from the Anthony Flint book. New urbanism has always had the sheen of a marketing ploy, the stuff of real estate development brochures. Indeed, it is. First of all, you can't say indeed it is about something that doesn't make sense. Grammatically doesn't make sense. Nevertheless, I think we can, I'll give them a 5 out of 10. But it's, it's always fascinating to see how people respond, and the underlining was very useful. So thank you to that person. So the open space element is inherent in new urbanism. I'm going to finish really soon so that we can have a little break and then James can start. And I have to leave. I have a meeting at 1. So then this I would actually disagree with Hebert in terms of new urbanism's awareness of the steps in 20th century planning history. I think new urbanism actually often ignores a lot of stuff and just looks superficially at elements, but maybe that's in the eye of the beholder, and in some respects maybe I can't see the wood for the trees. New urbanism has a charter you may know about. It's all about the diverse use of neighbourhoods. Here you can see the idea of pedestrian-based transit and so on. So, one of the major critiques is that new urbanism places can be designed and then they will just sit there. The wealthy people, or maybe the idealists, but wealthy people will use these places or flock to them, but everyone else just has to deal with their own crappy lives elsewhere. And because they are, I suppose, expensive places to create and to live in, it's they are in many ways, by definition, elitist. But you know, I think this is not exactly what Calthorpe is saying here in this quote, which we don't have time to read through. He's saying that you know, a rebirth of urban design, and I think like Dwani, he's saying, well, what we're doing is we're making exemplars, we're making models for others to follow. And it's certainly true that a lot of the ideas have filtered through into the wider ethos, and they continue to do so. Here's some Calthorpe walkability in a transit stop. I'm not going to go into this stuff. I did want to very quickly mention this part of Sydney that I visited in, you can see in 2009, that was greatly demonised at the time. Claymore, it's a 1970s housing development that was set up for major renewal in the, I think it was just in the last days of the previous Labor government in New South Wales, and the change of government, and there was kind of, the political will died out a bit, and I think it might be coming back somewhat. I don't know if you are familiar with this place, Springfield in Queensland, private development. I heard the founder of this place interviewed on the radio some years ago, and the interviewer kept trying to prompt him into admitting that his development had the same name as the town the Simpsons lived in, and he just was not going to admit that. Although it's pretty clear that it is. It does have that same name, but I guess he would say he got there first. Check out me being photobombed by a kid on a scooter in downtown Springfield, and really poorly planned in so many ways. You know, just a bit of a mess, we'd have to say. One of the things, this is not exactly entirely, this is where new urbanism, you know, I guess this is where we could say perhaps we've peaked new urbanism. We all know what's going on. Well, I hope we do all know what's going on at Fisherman's Bend right now, to the extent that anyone can know. It's still a bit of a movable feast, but what did start at Fisherman's Bend some time ago was the creation of there was a whole lot of questions about what do we got, what can we do, what will we do, what could we do about this place that was undeveloped land near the port facilities, but with a huge amount of space. There was some residential there. It was some of the poorest living conditions in Melbourne, and slowly we have a model housing estate created in the 1930s and 40s, known as Fisherman's Bend. Still a lot of questions about what can actually be done with this site. Ultimately, there's a plan to create a canal development there. This is in the 1980s. It gets as far as the Melways, and this is a kind of absolute boutique space that is going to attract the richest and most famous people of the world to purchase an apartment and enjoy this canal scenario. Guess what? None of that happened at all. The whole thing fell in a heap, and instead we got Beacon Cove. I don't know if you guys have been to Beacon Cove. I recommend you go and have a look at it. It gets shabbier by the year. I remember 20 years ago, probably 20 years ago, two PhD students from here. I wasn't a PhD student here, but I was allowed to spend time with them, and we drove around Beacon Cove at one evening, and they were both from the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. They're both architecture students, and they were both going, "Oh, it's awful, it's awful," which was a lot of fun for me. I didn't mind it. Beacon Cove totally adheres to a lot of these principles of new urbanism, with the very contentious aspect of the high-rise towers right on the beachfront, which means that anybody in the smaller, low-rise housing behind doesn't get an ocean view, but then it's not very high land. You probably wouldn't get one anyway. And those places are, 2 or 3 stories. There's the classic endpoint stuff of the retained heritage lighthouses, cafes, streets, the palm trees that were purchased at great cost from a regional winery and planted in Beacon Cove to create a sense of age and a bit of glamour. The open space, neither glamorous nor anything really. In 2012, one of the first things that Matthew Guy as Planning Minister did when the Liberals came into power was he rezoned a huge area of the rest of Fisherman's Bend as residential, and didn't tell anybody at all, including people in his own government or the appropriate departments. So they all had to fall over themselves to get information together to make it seem like this was actually a good idea. And we see, did I say 2012? Maybe it's 2011. Sorry, anyway. We see that this is an issue that's still being dealt with now, and there are some positive stories coming out of the Fisherman's Bend project under the present government, but there are still a lot of things going on in terms of what can actually be built, what can physically be built, what can appropriately be planned for these places. Some of it is unstable, not appropriate for building these kinds of rejects from Dubai because they'll sink. You've got to put them on kind of rafts or something. I don't know. I'm not an engineer. I don't really know how it works, but apparently it's not necessarily the greatest place to build this kind of stuff. And also the offhand approach to public transport provision and so on is always up for question in the original plans. I mean, I think things are possibly settling down, and you can make a case, I suppose, for big ideas and big announcements and being inspirational. So if anyone wants to make that case, please go ahead, but not on my time. I have to go. So shall we have, what should we do, James? Should we have a 5-minute break, and then so talk amongst yourselves what a dazzling array of wonderful ideas I've just heard would be something that you might want to start with. And yes, I have to go to a meeting. James will be up next. So
can I also just say, I went to Beacon Cove only for the first time in the last year or two, and it's a really good day out. It's so easy to get there. You just hop on the 109 and bam, you're there. It's really, really nice to walk around. You're right next to the port and the ocean, but you'll get to see all of this stuff firsthand. It's fascinating.
It's excellent. We should
it's a good day out.
Yeah, it's really good. And you can also go a little bit further and look at the late 1930s Housing Commission.
Yeah. And there are actually some good cafes as well.
There are.
You can actually have a good day.
Thanks. Okay.
Okay, let's get started. So my name's James Lesh, and I'm one of the tutors on this subject. And I'm giving a lecture on postmodernism, and we're going to deal a little bit with the theory that lay behind new urbanism, and look a little bit at the suburbs, but mostly look at CBD environments. And the reason that I've chosen this picture here, which is of Singapore, is because we see this relationship between old and new in the same ways we see it in new urbanism. We see it happening in established areas as well. We have the new of the skyscrapers and the old of what came before, which was really something new that came with postmodernism. It wasn't as well established in modernism with its kind of drive towards destruction and demolition of historic places. So the themes for the next hour are backlash and postmodernism, changing ideas of heritage and preservation, and the case study will be the Australian CBD, looking at it between the mid-60s and the mid-80s, and look at how heritage kind of was negotiated through the construction of new skyscrapers. And I'll be looking at the Rialto Towers in Melbourne, which I assume most of you are familiar with, or you will be by the end of this. But first, some definitions. What is heritage? I'm going to throw this out. What is heritage? Historical importance, yep.
Something from the past that defines you or it in the present.
Yep, yep,
There's a special cultural asset.
yep, okay, yep. So it's about the past, it's about people, it's about community, it's about the self as well. So this is kind of this neat definition here that was used in the 1970s in Australia of things we want to keep. That's what heritage is. Now there's a million definitions, but this is just the one we're going to work with today. So the second question is, what is heritage preservation?
Keeping the things we want to keep.
Well, that's right. And I think it's worth distinguishing between the two, because it's very easy to say something is heritage, but what are we going to do to keep it if we even want to keep it at all? And that comes down to questions of value. Again, like planners, but also what we value as a community as well as a keep. But to give you a bit of an academic definition, we're going to think of it today as a contested urban planning and architectural, historical and social process. And you could say a very similar thing for planning as well. But the key point is that it's a process in cities that comes to define cities as well. And it involves planning and planners, it involves architects and architectural systems, it involves the past, but it's also about the present too, the social present. And so these slides will go up. So now, when it comes to valuing Australian heritage, I think there's some things worth saying at the outset, because Australians haven't always valued their heritage, or at least not their urban heritage in their cities. So are these things heritage? Worth preserving? And I put these up because these were some of the first places that were World Heritage listed in the 1970s when that system emerged. So some historic centres in Poland, in Ecuador, and the Acropolis has been this kind of Western civilization. Now everything here, if you look at it in a sense, is about the West. Because those cities, even in Quito, were built through Western modes of urban planning. But it's this Western conception of heritage. So I'm just going to pause for 1 sec. I realise I'm in the wrong view. So what do we think of as Australian heritage? Well, I just kind of some quick stereotypes and images. Perth with the view from the Swan River at Kings Park, the Brisbane Queenslander homes, maybe Melbourne and its heritage laneways, the Sydney Harbour. Now every kind of city in Australia has had some kind of general images that inform its heritage, or myths that dominate how we understand the particular cities. And the first kind of moves towards understanding the cities through a heritage frame in Australia happened in the late 19th and early 20th century, where we see the invention of the idea of old colonial Sydney, for example. The old windmill in Brisbane gets preserved for the first time, and even the old Melbourne jail gets kept from the 1930s to the 1960s and kind of kept in some state. But really at that time, heritage was not a kind of a major preoccupation of urban planners, really, because of this reason. And this comes from Bruno Grollo, who's the guy I'm going to talk about a little bit later, a property developer in Melbourne, very, very famous in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and owns Grocon, or his children now run Grocon. So all the historic buildings worth looking at are in Paris or London. And with this kind of particular frame, if there's nothing historic worth valuing in the Australian city and worth keeping, well, we might as well just kind of put skyscrapers everywhere. That was kind of the mindset. And we're going to talk about, I mean, David briefly mentioned exporting skyscrapers, building skyscrapers in Australia that perhaps belong in Dubai. Well, this was the unrealised Grollo Tower for Docklands that was literally built in Dubai in a different form later on. So it wasn't until even the 90s and 2000s that the world started to take notice that Australia did have heritage places in its cities worth preserving. And these are the first places that were World Heritage listed in Australia in the 2000s. So we're not talking about natural heritage, we're talking here about cultural heritage. And that is the Royal Exhibition Building was the first. So it's really been a really recent thing in Australia that heritage, at least, is recognised globally as something of outstanding universal significance, which is the term that's used. But there are other, heritage operates in multiple and many different ways and many different contested ways. It doesn't have to be recognised as World Heritage to be heritage, nor does it have to be recognised, in order to be valued, I should say. And what we consider to be heritage keeps kind of shifting. So, for example, right now the big heritage battle in Sydney is over the Sirius building, which I kind of think is what's been referred to as being ugly, and therefore it should be demolished because it's brutalism. But it was judged by all the independent heritage councils in New South Wales as demanding to be protected. But the minister ultimately overrode the Heritage Council, the architects and planners' views, and is intending to sell this very, very centrally located housing off, public housing off. I think that in some ways the heritage of Sirius is as much about the fact that it's a brutalist building as it is about the very idea of centrally located, well-designed and well-serviced social housing on the harbour in the centre of the city. So when we think of heritage, we need to think of it not just in terms of its literal fabric design, but also in terms of place as well, and in terms of people and history and stories. The same thing happened similarly in Melbourne recently with the APM Boiler House, and there's an article in Architecture Victoria this month about that, where it will be demolished by Planning Minister Richard Winters, again, overrode the independent heritage advice of the council, which was an interesting case because it's possibly one of the first times that the minister's rejected the Heritage Council's decision, at least in 2 or 3 decades. So we're seeing a real disjuncture between the Heritage Council, between communities, between kind of the heritage experts and the architectural experts as well. And I put on the Corkman Hotel and Fed Square as other potential heritage or potential future heritage that are being contested for other reasons, particularly around the ideas of a heritage or an idea of public space, which I think can cross over here sometimes. I wanted to finish this slide by just identifying the fact that the heritage system is under strain now, just as it has been in the past. And another kind of tension that exists is that Australian cities have an Indigenous heritage that dates back millennia. And we can identify particular places in Melbourne from that, but also from the time when Indigenous people, after being kind of banished from the city in the 19th century, began to return in the 1920s and 30s and live in suburbs like Fitzroy and suburbs like Redfern. And there are real questions around how you meaningfully preserve that as well in a contemporary heritage system, because the Indigenous heritage systems are different as a parallel to the main heritage system. So it might be unfair to call it secondary, but it's certainly a different system with different processes around it. So we've spoken a little bit about suburbs and planned suburbs earlier with the new urbanism discussion. So I just kind of wanted to touch on that before jumping into CBDs. So if you'd asked an architect in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s in Melbourne what they think of this, many of them would have said it's unattractive, these sorts of terrace houses. They were seen as old-fashioned, out of date. They might have lacked water and sewerage, and there were moves from the kind of the early 20th century onwards for slum clearances to clear out these sorts of homes. And we had mass clearances in areas like Carlton, building the social housing that it's familiar today. So the Victorian Housing Commission undertook comprehensive redevelopment of inner suburban Australia, inner suburban Melbourne, and built things like the Atherton Gardens. And you can see here what Carlton looked like in 1945, and that's a contemporary image there. And you can see how the roads have been removed. The street pattern is no longer the same because they've literally demolished that entire area for this housing and removed the people from those areas. To give you kind of the quick version, from the 60s and 70s, well, particularly from the 60s onwards, there were protests from the people that lived in these neighbourhoods. And I like this one particularly because you can see the Royal Exhibition Building in the backdrop of this one. And in the end, through this kind of protest over neighbourhoods, the resident action groups and so on, the neighbourhoods, the people kind of got back having a say. It's kind of like the Robert Moses, Jane Jacobs story, repeated in a different form in Australia. And now I suppose in a sense we kind of unproblematically say these older houses are nice and we appreciate them and we recognise the diversity of different historic types and historic homes around the suburbs. And that it also includes in the inner suburbs as well, where we can see things here like conventional restorations or adaptive reuses or heritage design elements, lots of different ways that kind of the historic environment comes back in to cities and suburbs in areas that are not being replanned from scratch, but in areas that are being kind of adapting and changing in more organic ways. But as I said, I don't want to really talk a huge amount about the suburbs, because I wanted to talk about the CBD. But we have to set up the suburbs as something different to the CBD in order to have this kind of discussion. So has anyone seen this image before, this model of planning? Yeah. So what's it about?
It's usually a development model, so that what happens is it actually ends up pushing things out. So you end up with the poorer areas in the industry, residential, and then commuting, because that was the nicer areas, and usually then it keeps sort of a transition, so it starts to push into other zones, but then I suppose it's now come around. It's very old.
Yes, it first kind of emerged in the 1920s and really dominated city planning up until about the 60s. And the idea is it's the donut city, and you'd have a hollow core where people worked. Then you have a transitional zone of inner suburbs, which in the Melbourne case were a suburb like Carlton and Collingwood, where in effect poor people would live while they were in transition to become wealthier through hard work and labour, and they would eventually move out to the middle, what today would be the middle suburbs, but were then the outer suburbs, into kind of suburbia, which was seen as the ideal. So that, in part, this was the explanation for why they sought to demolish those inner city areas of Melbourne and Carlton to kind of create this city, this emptying out of the city. So the CBD kind of becomes this space of men and work and function, and then the suburbs, as Dolores Hayden says, becomes the area of women and children and kind of living separate from that. Or put into kind of, in artwork, Collins Street at 5 p.m, everyone's departing the city, all men, to their kind of new suburban developments, taking the train out, say. Now, that was the model of city development, but it wasn't necessarily what, certainly by the 60s and 70s, people wanted anymore. People decided, well, we actually want to live in the inner suburbs again. And so that's where that kind of protest comes from. But it also means that the CBD is no longer this area of kind of pure function. It becomes this area that kind of something kind of starts to change, where people start to value what's in that centre. So to give some context and kind of turn back to kind of the theory and to the broader chronology. So by the late 20th century, there's a shift from employment to manufacturing, and we have all these kind of economic changes that are taking place. So the context for this isn't just an architectural style, it's also kind of a change in culture as well, and change in economy. And to facilitate these new changes, and what's called changes to kind of time and space in terms of globalisation, in terms of production and in terms of consumption, the CBDs will change, as will the suburbs too. And so the idea is we're going from an industrial economy to a post-industrial or service or knowledge-based economy. And to kind of achieve that, something is changing in the cities, in the CBDs. Now, to achieve change in the Australian CBD, or in particular, that it becomes quite a contested area, because these are where the oldest buildings generally are, the oldest places generally are. And it becomes always hotly contested there because of the kind of the high land values, but also the strong connections that people have to place as well. So this slide here is Melbourne in 1956. Any idea why I would choose 1956? Olympics, yep. Melbourne hosts the Olympics in 1956. And behind me is this kind of relatively low-heighted city. Here's some further images. Now that image with the Penfolds of kind of the light and the illuminations would be seen very much as Melbourne modernity of that period. We've got the MCG, Flinders Street Station as well. So the city is on display at this time, and it has that relationship between new and old, the one that I mentioned briefly before. And through things like these posters or these stamps, we can also see how the image of Melbourne is being projected outwards. So at the same time as this modern, rejuvenating city, or those modernist narratives, there's also this existence of the old too. And the old here is this image here on the left-hand side, looking down at Swanston Street, of the older buildings and the newer buildings and the street lighting and everything else. So here's another one of those aerial views. Instead of being in a suburb, we're in the CBD. And you can see how that kind of flatness has kind of transformed upwards, but there hasn't been that kind of change in the street layout really at all since it was laid in the 1830s. Certainly not from the image that you can see from space, anyway. So Melbourne becomes this skyscraper city in the last few decades. And that's when I kind of want to explore how Melbourne became that skyscraper city and what that has to do with postmodernism, with heritage, if at all. And it kind of works on a few assumptions. It wasn't inevitable that Melbourne would build skyscrapers in the CBD. The fate of heritage and skyscrapers are linked. And to kind of understand those ties, we can use that theory of the theories of postmodernism and conceptions of heritage and change that I kind of highlighted at the start. So what's modernist urbanism? What's that? And we've kind of touched on this a number of times in the previous lectures and earlier today. There's this rationalism, this Le Corbusian notion of self-confidence about linear progress, about scientific and technical knowledge, about the infinite growth, without any concern about the limitless, that there would ever be a limit of resources, physical resources or capital resources as well. And that all this ran as a natural law, in a sense. And so by the post-war period, that kind of seemed like a state image. Well, it's being pursued across Melbourne and really across much of the world through this kind of technocratic paradigm, but it gets challenged through the backlash, which has already been mentioned in previous lectures, and will be again, as well as post-structural and postmodern ideas as well. So the critique was that it had a particular social and aesthetic vision, that the planners held particular values, which reified linear progress, reified scientific rationality, and placed the expert on this such a high pedestal where perhaps they didn't belong. And skyscrapers have an interesting role to play because they're the quintessential kind of modernist building form. They also become the quintessential kind of contemporary global building form as well. But again, that wasn't a linear path. So to give you a bit on skyscrapers, they feature in cities across the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and are always kind of the changing physical embodiment of different ideologies. So they can change in architectural style, neoclassicism, Art Deco, international style postmodernism. But at least by their builders, they're always presented as celebratory and spectacular, and by their financiers and architects as well. And we kind of ascribe particular ideologies to them. The idea of we consider them to be markers of social, economic and urban progress in our cities. I think that's probably an unproblematic thing to say. So Australians embrace them in some ways, influenced by their North American counterparts. But in Australia, it was very limited because there was a height limit of around 130 feet, so about 60 or 70 metres in every Australian city. And so there was a kind of a contest played out in the cities around modernism and what it meant to have the modern city, and was it going to be that kind of European city of the low to medium density, or was it going to be the American city of the skyscrapers? And there's an article on LMS written by Ben Schrader, which, if you're interested in these debates, it details them for Melbourne. It's also worth saying that these were skyscrapers. So what we consider to be a skyscraper today is something a lot bigger than 50 metres, but that was a skyscraper for the period. But even then, there's this kind of continued pressure and progress to change even these environments. And we end up in the post-war period with the kind of bigger skyscrapers. Now, to kind of give you the end of that story about whether Australia chose that kind of European model or that North American model, well, Australia kind of chose to go with the Americans and built skyscrapers. And that's kind of the end of the story. Although it might also be fair to say that Europe are now, especially in the last 10 years, if you look at a city like London, they're also embracing that model as well. So ICI House in Melbourne, which is heritage listed, was completed in 1958 and was the first truly modernist breaking of that ceiling skyscraper. Henry Seidler, who's one of Australia's greatest modernist architects, mostly worked in Sydney, although around the world as well. His very famous Australia Square kind of typified the Sydney case. For architectural historians Jennifer Taylor and Susan Stewart, no other building represents the excitement, the prosperity, the vision of Australia as it embarked on the second half of the 20th century. No other building type is more indicative of the economic rationalism and more demonstrative of the widespread destruction of the historic urban fabric that characterised the renewal in the rush for progress. So we see this kind of embrace, but it also means there's something there before. And that's kind of what that thing that was there before that I'm going to speak about in a few studies, and particularly about the Rialto. A particularly interesting case is the Eastern Markets in Melbourne. So Melbourne had a series of markets at different parts of the city, from the fish markets at Flinders Street, which were a beautiful building, to the Eastern Markets as well. They kind of run into disrepair, and in 1961 the Southern Cross Hotel is built there. And so it's a city bound to progress. I love these kind of images on this slide of the Southern Cross because it's basically straight out of Mad Men. It's modernity, it's 1950s and 60s coolness and sleekness in Melbourne. This building has been demolished, by the way. You can't go there now. So let's jump to America again. 1910, Penn Station in New York is completed. 1968, it's demolished for Madison Square Gardens. So what's happening in Australia is happening in the US too, and they're demolishing buildings that today would be unproblematically preserved and considered to be heritage, but they're rebuilding them in that kind of rush again for progress. Now, something a little bit different happens when it comes to Grand Central Terminal in New York, which was also marked for demolition in the 60s. Instead, as you can kind of see there, that's the terminal, and then the Pan Am building is built behind it. It's even more demonstrative there. So things are starting to change where you don't just demolish it, you start to keep particular places as well. Now, so there's the start of this questioning of this narrative newness of grandiosity and novelty there. And the famous example is actually a suburban example, housing estate in Missouri. And the architectural theorist Charles Jenks suggested the death of modern architecture on the 15th of July 1972 at 3:32 p.m. And that was when this housing estate, the Pruitt de Gault, St. Louis, Missouri housing estate, was demolished, which had actually only been finished in 1955. So that's kind of simultaneous to what's happening, say, at the Pan Am building, where it's being built rather than Grand Central Terminal being demolished as it would have been 10 or 15 years earlier. So around this question of backlash, something had kind of gone wrong with the modernist vision, and often that's kind of referred to as being the places for people, particularly, and whether that modernist technocratic paradigm could really deliver for people as much as it claimed that it would. In Melbourne, so it's kind of a bit funny, but in Melbourne, the image of Will and the Wrecker is one that really kind of infuses the psyche. He was the person responsible for demolishing much of inner Melbourne. He apparently, up in the northern suburbs, had a fantastic yard where you could see all the marble that he had removed from the 19th century buildings. If you're walking along Sydney Road, there's still a Will and the Wrecker sign for the old his old offices, so you should check that out. It's pretty cool. 1973, by the way, by perhaps coincidence, was called the Year of the Wrecker in Melbourne. So these things are happening in multiple places simultaneously. Speaking of backlash, I had Jane Jacobs on there very briefly before. The changing ideas of the city are reflected in these kind of texts in Australia, ideas for Australian cities. Notice the skyscraper that's being carried in the Bruce Petty cartoon on the first edition of Ideas for Australian Cities. Leonie Sandercock Cities for Sale, and then Lloyd and Troy, who are both Commonwealth Government cities administrators, who write about what was happening in the federal government over the previous decade. So, sorry, I should say, in these books, they're establishing kind of opposition to the dominant modernist narrative. So the postmodernists here, and they wouldn't call themselves postmodernists, maybe Leona Sandercock would, but what they're kind of proposing is more of a diversity of potential urban solutions, and the kind of imperatives and contextual political and historical awareness, and this is premised on community. So what's postmodernism, at least from an urban perspective? Well, rejection of the grand narrative, the rejection of totality, the changing kind of questioning of different statuses as well. Now, when it comes to cities, Michael Deere was one of the lead writers who wrote on this from 1986 onwards, and gives us three meanings for postmodernism. And I suppose the same could be said for modernism or any other kind of ism of this kind. So it's an epoch or a time period, it's an architectural style, and it's also a method of critiquing and thinking about cities. And one of the outcomes too is, within that kind of pursuit of multiplicity, of diversity, is changing ways of heritage preservation too. Now, this is one of those graphs, similar to tables similar to the one David put up before, where it's kind of a stereotype of what it contained, because the modernists would have said the same. The modernist avant-garde would have said, Le Corbusier would have said, "What are you talking about?" He would have said, "I'm all those things on the right. I'm all those things postmodernist." That it's these kind of useful for getting your head around the stereotypes around the particular ideas. So where does heritage preservation fit? Well, in its kind of current understanding of the way we do heritage today, it's a response to that modernist backlash. And it's it might also be thought of as almost a post-modern sensibility in epoch, style and method. So Jane Jacobs in 1961 said preservation is key to community in her fights against Robert Moses for East Village. Edward Rolfe, who's another theorist, old buildings and districts have ceased to be considered simply as impediments to rational planning and now regarded as invaluable as well. In the same way as new urbanism starts to quote the past or the imagined past, that similar things are happening in existing suburbs and in existing cities and CBDs too. Postmodernism kind of begins to question that Western conception of heritage that I spoke about earlier. And within even the heritage processes, such as through UNESCO or through the federal government, what is valued doesn't have to conform to the statutes of Europe so much anymore. I think what was happening at that time, and this is often referred to as the Australian Heritage Movement, which kind of existed in the 60s and 70s. So Tommy Wren, who became the Minister for Cities under Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, as I strolled through the city, the very heart of it seemed to be torn out. I thought, haven't they accrued enough wealth without destroying something that belongs to our heritage? Why can't somebody in authority create a fund to protect such beauty, our very heritage? One really feels so bewildered. Is this progress? So this is a kind of a federal Labor minister who become a federal Labor minister saying this and using heritage as a way into conducting that critique about modernism. So the Labor Whitlam government comes to power in 1973 before being dismissed in 1975. The other context is the Green Ban movement, which was an Australian kind of first, and the union movement put bans on demolishing buildings in historic environments. They said, we're not going to do it. If the community wants this area to stay, we're going to put a green ban on it. Petra Kelly, who founded the German Greens Party, came to Australia in 1984, met Jack Mundy, who's the one being arrested behind me, and credited the Green Ban's direct action as part of the inspiration for the German Greens. So Australia actually goes from being seen as this kind of heritage backwater to being kind of at the forefront of direct action around heritage and around cities and around community participation as well. So the rocks would have been totally demolished otherwise, and the Sirius building, which is in the rocks, I don't think you can, maybe you can kind of see it, I know you can't really. The rocks becomes that kind of the hotbed in the Sirius, which is finished in the late 70s, is the last kind of vestige of that renewal process. Now, remarkably, the Whitlam government did an inquiry into what it called the national estate, which was its particular Australian idea for heritage. And this federal government report found the Australian government has inherited a national estate which has been downgraded, disregarded and neglected. Continued economic and demographic growth must not doom valuable historic environments. So at the top levels of government, there's this questioning of the modernist vision, at least under the Whitlam government. And it's been done again through heritage. So this was the now doomed Anzac Square, which was going to be demolished, but wasn't in the end for a number of reasons, as well as Max Hotel in the CBD on Franklin Street, which everyone just kind of believed would be demolished as well. Now, the context for these demolitions not happening is that, and in a sense also for Whitlam being dismissed from power, was the oil crisis, which hit in 1973-74. So we again have economic factors come into play where the money dries up. There isn't the money for comprehensive renewal anymore, but we'll put that to one side. In the National Estate Report, you kind of see this new kind of change in how people are conceiving their cities. They're not just as these kind of neutral, top-down kind of physical sites that need to be kind of replanned scientifically, but rather the thoughts around people start to enter government reports and start to enter kind of planning more generally. So the research I've done is specifically into these three skyscrapers, MLC Centre in Sydney, Bond Tower in Perth, after Alan Bond, the crook, who ended up, he's dead now, so I can kind of say whatever I want. He was part of a huge corruption scandal, many corruption scandals, including in the construction of this skyscraper. He also bought the world's most expensive building called Irises and displayed it on the top floor of that building when it was completed. And it was put in the New York Times as the most expensive Van Gogh's Irises when it was displayed. He then went bankrupt the year after. After that happened, again, economic kind of ups and downs of the 80s in this case. So some of that's in my article, not as much as I would have liked, but you can search for Alan Bond's bathrooms, and if you search for that, you will find on the top level of the Bond Tower his marble-encased bathroom spaces, which some people got to see a couple of years ago when it was open for sale. That's all I'm going to say about the Bond Tower. MLC Centre is another Henry Seidler. The reason it's in here as well is because there was a heritage campaign to save the Theatre Royal, and that was one of the kind of early examples of CBD heritage advocacy in Australia and in Sydney. Now, they don't keep any of the historic buildings, although they do rebuild part of what you can see, that little mushroom building. That's the Commercial Travellers Association, and they do put some old stuff into there, and they do build a new theatre. Now, for Henry Seidler, it's seen as a massive compromise, just building a theatre back into the new building. But if he'd been building 5 years later, he probably would have had to keep the theatre. So we're seeing these kind of functional negotiations around heritage. But let's talk about Rialto. So in 1977, I should say, the National Mutual Life Association of Australia completed its acquisition of a series of 19th century buildings in Melbourne along Collins Street. Now, Collins Street has always kind of been the centre of has been the kind of major thoroughfare of commerce in Melbourne. It's the most symbolic address. If you're a company that means anything, you need a big building on Collins Street. So when it's then over the kind of the 50s and 60s, a lot of these older buildings were demolished and new modernist buildings were built, many of which are now actually getting demolished again. And so it was a big deal. You kind of wanted to build on Collins Street, you wanted to have your office on Collins Street, and you wanted to build up on Collins Street. So when National Mutual Life kind of tried to amalgamate this block, this financial company, and it had these various historic buildings on it, the Robs Building, the York Butter Factory, the Queen Anne Star, Winfield, and the Neo-Gothic Rialto building, which is the hotel that's still there. And all of these buildings were built in the 1880s, marvellous Melbourne period, big economic boom of that time. So that it was no longer the 50s or 60s, it was the 70s. And so there was a kind of, something happened. Now National Mutual still think that they can kind of demolish it, but they're not going to kind of get away with it this time. And so the Collins Street Defence Movement forms. Now the Collins Street Defence Movement, this is a little kind of icon of theirs, Collins Street, it's standing in the way of progress. There's a lot of questioning around this idea of progress. The Collins Street Defence Movement was kind of some ratbags in their 20s, kind of putting their kind of fist to power and saying we want to have more of a say in our city and we believe Collins Street is important, even though we don't actually live here. They're saying they're kind of claiming over the CBD. But many of those people involved have actually ended up becoming big corporate people, a future Lord Mayor of Melbourne, a whole lot of other kind of very distinguished people there. A lot of the people involved in the heritage movement in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s ended up being city shapers of some kind. So Rialto was under debate. Collins Street had also, because of all that change, become the symbolic heart of heritage activism in the CBD as well. And they were kind of, and so they were kind of friendly with the National Trust, which was doing heaps of heritage advocacy like they do today, but they were a little bit more radical than them as well. Now, their position was there should be a complete development freeze on Collins Street of all investment, of all development, until a proper heritage study is done of the street. And that position actually had popular currency at the time as well. And it was this idea that Melbourne was losing its Victorian era character, and that was something that was important, and we kind of wanted to keep this past in the CBD too. Darryl Jackson, architect, releases the Convention Centre scheme in 1979, and so this was to be a large convention centre. There'd be a casino there as well, and there's this mixed streetscape. So there's a modernist building there, and there's the heritage buildings that were all going to be kept right down to the corner, including the Robs building that was ultimately demolished on the corner. And it's kind of relishing or embracing that diversity of streetscape in the same way as new urbanism does in its new way. This was also happening in its kind of older way as well in the CBDs. Now, by this time though, with the different kind of groups kind of yelling at each other, nobody was willing to make a decision about what should happen, as kind of often happens in these cases. And because of that, that scheme, which was probably an all right one if it had gone ahead, ends up being canned. And Barry Humphrey says the year before, if we have any pride left in the city, can't we stop crying about marvelous Melbourne, wishing to rip down the Rialto? Melbourne now resembles, and so on and so forth. Why not call ourselves mutilated Melbourne? So Melbourne's having these debates over what it is and what its heritage is. Along comes Bruno Grollo. Now, they were a family of Italian migrants and developed these innovative concrete construction technologies. So how did the Grollo company break the impasse? Well, they bought a financial option over the site, which was an innovative way of doing it. They were funded by an overseas Dubai-based development fund to do that. So there's money coming in from overseas. Then they offer the construction unions record entitlements to make sure that the green band, or what's called a black band in Melbourne, was dropped over the site. They then meet with the planning minister, almost probably monthly, for about 12 months. The planning minister then sacks the City of Melbourne because they're unhappy that the City of Melbourne hasn't been making its planning decisions quick enough. Then the Premier and the Council vow to assess the site as soon as possible to give the developer certainty. In some ways this is kind of a very familiar narrative on how development happens in the CBDs. But at the same time, despite the kind of new existence of a heritage system as well, They actually say we're not willing to wait for the heritage report because we have to achieve developer certainty for the site. And then eventually, after kind of changing a few times, the Rialto gets built. And here's the kind of like the kind of architectural shot here. You could never actually see that in real life, but that's what it looked like. So they retain the historic buildings at the front and build the kind of the attached twin towers at the back. So this was the ultimate kind of design response to the site. And so kind of to rush through from that kind of 60s modernist to that backlash, that participatory moment, to the 80s of this new participatory planning system, well, it immediately kind of gets undermined as well once there's huge capital involved, whereby there are ways that the influence can be exerted in this new postmodern system. I guess this is also the same era as neoliberalism starts to emerge in the 80s, and economic rationalism in Australia in the 80s and 90s as well. So the community learned the new skyscraper despite 5 years of activism in 1981 from the newspapers, and 2,000 people then marched through Melbourne saying, well, what on earth has happened? We thought we were going to get a say, and we don't seem to be getting a say anymore. Norman Day, in language that is not appropriate for me to say out loud, called it that. And it's probably not also appropriate for me to say out loud either. Keith Dunstan described it as that building. So people immediately start to like it as well. Now I'm going to throw a different reading at you. This was seen as kind of best practice heritage, and it won all the heritage awards from the moment it was completed. So the new kind of, what's often called the heritage industry, awarded it to itself for this particular refurbishment, particularly at the Intercontinental Hotel. And it was seen as this exemplary example of this postmodern pastiche, that mix of new and old integrating together. So in the past, when you wouldn't have built a new skyscraper and then kept what was there, now they're kind of coming together at the same time. So the historic buildings are inside this atrium, which is this mixed-use public-private space at the bottom, at the entranceway to the skyscraper. So it serves a kind of a design solution or a podium as well for the skyscraper, and becomes a political walk-around. It pushes the streetscape. It kind of fixes the streetscape issue because the skyscraper is further back into the block. And it also means policymakers and the developers can draw public attention towards heritage as being a positive outcome for the community from the development. So it's in many ways, of those 3 skyscrapers that I showed you, this was actually the best outcome of all 3. It's immediately projected on kind of postcards of the city, and it's from the Rennie Ellis collection. So it becomes a relief of I suppose to a new generation of tower boosters, of people that like skyscrapers. The postmodern urbanism, with all its kind of participatory elements, meant tempered but not unlimited heritage protection. Norman Day, who was another critic at the time, said could not believe they were still building skyscrapers, an architecture critic. He said, after all the failures of the machines for living, which was the Le Corbusier term, why are we still building skyscrapers like this? But there was a kind of a very brief inflection point where, again, Melbourne was questioning the skyscraper and whether they would be or would not be built in the city. To give you a bit more of a potted history to the present day, so the new skyscraper inevitably, obviously, transformed the on-the-ground experiences and the amenity impacts, and also transformed what the heritage on the site means. Just because you keep fabric doesn't mean it's a kind of meaningful version of heritage preservation. Now, after this incident between 1981 and 1984 with the Rialto, the state government never fully restored the City of Melbourne's planning powers. The City of Melbourne eventually had elections 10 years later in 1994, but at that time they created a new category called state significance, which is otherwise known as the 25,000 square metre rule. And that rule says that if a building is over 25,000 square metres, it's the decision of the planning minister, not of the City of Melbourne. So they got much limited planning powers after this event. And after that, there's the plot ratio changes as well, which means that you no longer needed podiums and so forth. So from the kind of Rialto onwards, there's a series of regulatory and planning changes that end up in Melbourne becoming the skyscraper city that it is today through that kind of new paradigm. And I'm glad I've got time to show this video in just a moment. Now, the skyscraper here, in many ways, is framed pretty well exactly in the same way as the modernists framed it, at least from kind of the big picture perspective, which always kind of makes me ask that question to myself, whether we're all kind of still modernists. And the reality tells also gets projected out. And I hope we've got sound. This is what it looked like in the 1980s.
It might be that you need to get out of the
Cheers, thanks.
side that's in problem.
It's kind of cool being able to go to YouTube to find historical sources to kind of evidence this point around how quickly the Rialto kind of gets brought into the image of Melbourne as this kind of as I said before, projected outwards as part of the city, and erases so much of that conflict that had preceded it for the previous 10 years. And that image on the left, so I grew up in Melbourne, so we actually went to the Rialto Towers when I was in primary school, and we had our net ticket, and we went up the skyscraper. And it's this kind of integration, I guess, of commerce here, and bringing school students into that. It becomes as naturalised as anything that you can imagine. And that point of naturalisation in the landscape is a key one in postmodernism, because one of its tenets is deconstructivism. And the notion of that is that kind of constant questioning of particular narratives on the city, or particular questions around planners and value, because you wouldn't question the value of planners without that kind of postmodernist or deconstructivist sensibility. And all of Australian cities, I guess you could say in a sense, big cities are all skyscraper cities, and we now have this as the cities around the world, and we across many cities have a quite specialised approach to preservation when it comes to the historic environment. There are still kind of contests over it, but it's accepted now that skyscrapers and heritage can be integrated together. And I think that's interesting, because it's kind of in a sense nonsensical. How can you integrate a 3-storey building with a 50-storey one? But there's a way of doing that, and that's what's done through heritage. So the other consequence of that is that the fabric of these older buildings get emphasised more than the kind of social narratives around them. So it's just emphasising this tangible and exposed heritage over the intangible and the enshround. So it's in that kind of, bring it back to postmodernism, it's in that rejection of the singular, authentic heritage outcome of that European monument, or that monumental European heritage, that the kind of postmodern heritagey skyscraper comes about. And then that in and of itself is a heritage today, as we start to preserve Henry Sadler's buildings and other skyscrapers around Melbourne, in Melbourne as well, like the ICI House too. So now skyscrapers themselves are a heritage that there are people in this department who are working on and looking at how we preserve skyscrapers and what skyscrapers we preserve too. And the modern skyscrapers are actually really good from a preservation perspective, because they're so kind of flexible in their layouts. So I wanted to finish on the last slide to say, does heritage matter? I hope everyone will say yes. But here are kind of a few ways of thinking about heritage, some of which I've touched on today and some of which I haven't. So it was, in its kind of original formation, it was all about bringing back people and communities into the conversation in that context of the backlash. So that's where it's supposed to be at its essence. It's not meant to be about the heritage consultants and so forth. It's about kind of questioning aspects of urban design to embrace based in design responses questions around heritage. And there are studios now, again in this department, where the architects actually get given a heritage space and have to work with and respond to in particular ways, not just for an old-fashioned restoration, and actually creating something new that also draws cleverly off the old, like in ways that new urbanism may or may not. It's kind of a rule of thumb to say that not demolishing a building is better for the environment than demolishing it pretty well in most, if not all, circumstances. So there's a sustainability aspect to it around embodied energy in the buildings. Heritage can be part of placemaking, and also finally putting the theories and ideas of this subject into practice too fits quite nicely in a heritage frame. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I'll be David for a second. Are there any questions before we go?
I guess.
What's your view, what do you think about the MSG building and that facade that they used? It's the old bank building.
Oh yeah.
Because that's just sort of what you're saying about the material, sort of focusing on the fabric, but the historical stories.
So when you said the MSD building, Melbourne School of Design, two things came to mind. The first is the old commerce facade. Now that was actually in the old building as well as the facade. So, and facadism is a huge question, and it's kind of seen as, or it might be an appropriate response in some situations, and in some situations it wouldn't be. Well, now when it comes to that specific example, the old, moving that front to that building, the first time it was done, I think 30 or 40 years ago, was one of the earliest examples of facadism in Melbourne. So I think it's kind of ironic for it to be facaded again. And I'm kind of glad it was kept, because it does show the kind of heritage of facadism in and of itself. But the second heritage element of the Melbourne School of Design, most obvious one that there are heaps, is the Japanese room on the level 4, which was imported to Australia in the 1960s from Japan, and was in the original Melbourne in the previous building and planning, and that's been recreated inside the Melbourne School of Design, and I think that's a nice response too. But both of those are fabric oriented, and there are heaps of other things going on there as well. So I didn't give you an answer about my opinion, but I think it's kind of cool that, overall I think it's kind of cool that it's there. Yeah.
And they actually got the original Japanese architect flown over to remake this Japanese room, didn't they?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you haven't been in that space, try and sneak in sometime.
Yeah.
It's pretty
It's easy
wonderful.
enough.
Yeah. There's a Japanese garden out the other side of it as well. And yeah, sorry, if you do have any more questions, feel free to ask me now, or come up to me, or ask whichever. I imagine some people want to go, so yeah, cool. Thanks again.
So Catherine told me to tell you she had to leave, but that was great. And I agree. That was a really great book.
Ad from Channel 7 in the 80s is not historical, because I can remember it. It's historical if I can't remember it.
Do you have to actually do it automatically?